Hello, this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech looking at a deck known as Bob Bolt and moving it into the modern format. For those of you not already familiar with the modern format, there's a wonderful thing that really feeds into this deck. It's the fetch lands and shock lands. Individuals are very greedy and often ignore their life total. Very possible for individuals to take 3, 5, even as much as 7 damage in the first turn or two off of their own land and their own spells. The deck here is basically a lightning bolt to the face every single turn. The idea is to blow your opponent out of the water by just hitting them with direct damage again and again and again. This is based off of a test deck that I used to use long ago, which was all land and a bunch of lightning bolts. And the idea was if I couldn't stand up to that deck, I would definitely have trouble with super aggressive decks. So now I've built that deck in several different formats, most notably in Legacy, and had some success with it in Legacy. But this is the attempt to move it over to the modern format. The nice thing about the modern format, as mentioned earlier, was that individuals can take damage from their own land, cutting down the number of lightning bolts you need to hit them with. In fact, even just 2 fetch lands combos extremely well with the 18 points of damage you're going to get out of 6 lightning bolts. There are situations, though, where that number can even go significantly down. I've had lots of games that have ended after 5 lightning bolts, and even a few that have ended after only 4 aggressive spells. Why do we add Dark Confidant to this particular deck? A traditional burn lightning bolt deck just hits your opponent again and again with lightning bolts. The reason is that our opponents are not goldfish. They actually try to fight back, which cuts down the effectiveness of the deck significantly. Bob deals with most of those threats. Dark Confidant is a wonderful way to overcome counter spells. If your opponent gains a little bit of life, the massive card advantage you're going to get off of Dark Confidant easily overcomes that. If your opponent is ripping cards out of your hand very early, especially using something like Inquisition of Kozilek, you have a way to refill your hand. And if you mulligan with this deck, Dark Confidant really brings you back into the game. I've won lots of 5-card mulligans with this deck just because I had Dark Confidant on turn 2 to dig me out of that hole. Now, you're probably wondering, why is Dark Confidant called Bob? Well, it was named after Bob Mayer, who is a very famous Magic player, one of the all-time greats. He won an invitational and was able to design his own card. He's even done an article on this particular card a few times and even apologized to players that a lot of players have ended up missing the trigger there and ended up with unfortunate game losses. I think it's actually an extremely well-designed card from a power level. The balance of taking that life to gain extra cards is great. I do agree that the mechanic could have been implemented a little bit better, but I'm extremely used to it. And the tip that I really have for individuals is take a die, put it directly on top of your deck when you have Dark Confidant out so that you don't miss the trigger before moving on to your draw step. Now, here's the list that I'm currently working on in Modern. I understand that this list is a little bit rough. It is really a transplant from Legacy, and I'm open to any ideas on how I can make this list better. The cost here is pretty low for a Modern deck at $550. It's wrapped up in 2 cards here, really, in the Fetch Lands and the Dark Confidants. If you pull Fetch Lands and Dark Confidants, the deck actually gets really cheap, about $150, and is still rather competitive. Isochronic Scepter and Pyromancer's Ascension are the 2 cards I would strongly consider using for a budget version of this deck. It is not anywhere near as strong as the version with Dark Confidants, but you can also eliminate pretty much all the creatures and blank your opponent's removal spells if you go one of these 2 routes. I love Isochronic Scepter. I've definitely won several tournament games where the only spell I've cast is a Lightning Helix on top of an Isochronic Scepter. I have also lost several times to Abrupt Decay using the card, so it's a little bit weak in an environment where you're expecting a lot of black-green. Pyromancer's Ascension is often great game 1, and a lot of people have sideboard hate for it, so I would lean towards the Scepter, but you're going to get higher variance out of the deck. Let's go back to the essence of the deck here. There's 16 Lightning Bolts. One of the major things about this deck is that people look at Bump in the Night or Lava Spike and go, oh, these aren't versatile cards, and pull them. Huge mistake in this deck. You're going to get a lot of free wins by just bolting someone in the face for the first 3 turns. Do not pull any of these cards unless you're trying to create an entirely different deck with a different curve and a different strategy. If you'll notice, the curve in this deck is extremely low. Almost all the spells are 1 casting cost. Your land count is as low as 19. I've seen people even run less than that. There are several bolts at the 2 casting cost range that I've strongly considered and even played. This current version is playing Lightning Helixes, which has a nice life gain to it and gives you a huge edge against other super aggressive decks. Skullcrack is a very tough card to play. Individuals often wait too long and try to get some double value out of it. If you just play it as a bolt in a lot of situations, unless your opponent specifically has a Scavenging Ooze or a Deathrite Shaman on the board, it's a very strong card. A Boros Charm, if you've got the colors, has 4 damage, which often is incredible. Searing Blaze, though, has to be my absolute favorite in a world filled with Deathrites and with robots, because you're getting a 2-for-1 out of it. It can clear the path for your Dark Confidant to attack, and it still does 3 solid damage. Now, there's some less than exciting cards to fill those last few spots also. Magma Jet in here is solid, but it only does 2 damage, and 2 damage is a lot less than 3. 50% less matters a huge amount. I would consider Magma Jet in a build that doesn't have Dark Confidants, because the Scry ability is going to be needed to make sure that you still have good cards coming. Pillar of Flame is a really nice option if you are running into decks that have a lot of graveyard interaction and cards that you just want to permanently remove, although you're moving into the control realm there and not into the damage realm. Sudden Shock has to be my favorite against both robots and counterspell decks that have things like Merfolk in play, because it can't be countered, and I will never, ever play Shock again if I can ever help myself. I have lost so many games with an opponent at 2 or 1 life because I had Shocks in there instead of something more useful. In the creature spot, my current complement is 4 Dark Confidants, 3 Grim Lavamancers, and 4 Goblin Guides. The Lavamancer usually does about 4 damage, and it crushes both robots and Deathrite Shaman. It also is really nice against several of the other Mana Dork-based decks out there. I really love him. The best first turn, though, that many other people put forward is Deathrite Shaman. I am not convinced that Deathrite Shaman is right for this deck. Lots of people are playing Deathrite Shaman hate, but if you put Deathrite Shaman in, I won't blame you. I would up the number of fetch lands, though, so that you're able to feed your own Deathrites if you need to. A very solid card. Hellspark Elemental is a nice honorable mention here. Definitely seen him do 3 to 6 damage. Other people like Steplinks. I'm not too excited about it in a world where you have Electrolyze running around. He can often contribute to a 2-for-1 against you, but he does have the potential to do a lot of damage, especially with a higher fetch land count. The lands in this deck really depend on what your sideboard looks like. This deck can be built with just Blood Crypts and Blackcleave Cliffs, along with mountains to keep the mana base rather inexpensive. If you really want a very diverse sideboard, though, I would recommend the fetch lands and some singletons of some of the other shock lands. Your best first turn in this deck is clearly Goblin Guide. Goblin Guide on first turn 99% of the time hits for 2 damage. Often, if you're on the play, he's going to hit for 4 or even 6 damage. It's like he's throwing out 2 lightning bolts himself. And when you're playing with Searing Blaze in the deck, you're able to clear your way through for a Goblin Guide. I love this guy. Keep your hands with Goblin Guide. These are 2 cards that people often throw into these decks, and they're terrible. I do not like Vexing Devil. The Punisher mechanic is almost always bad. You put this guy out, your opponent has Swords to Plowshares, you're going to get an extra land, and this is a deck, or you're going to get extra life in Legacy, or Path to Exile in Modern, you're going to get an extra land, and this is a deck that really doesn't need that extra land. It doesn't have haste, so they've got time to put out a blocker, and it's just not a good card. And Spark Elemental, yes, it looks like it's a lightning bolt, but it's not a lightning bolt. It can be burned, it can be hit with Electrolyze, it can be blocked very easily. I do not like the card at all. Avoid these 2. Play test it for yourself and make your own judgment, but I counsel against these 2. Your good matchups are anything that's slow, especially where it's going to be taking a pretty good amount of damage from their own lands, especially if they're using fetch lands or opposing Dark Confidants. When somebody else is taking damage from their cards, it lowers the amount of cards that you actually have to resolve to win. Won lots of games where my opponent drops a Dark Confidant and then takes 2 or 3 damage off of the Dark Confidant, and they die on turn 4 before they're able to stabilize. Your rough matchups here are Chalice of the Void on 1. Your sideboard needs to be able to deal with that, and Wormcoil Engine. So your Urzatron decks, be prepared for those and try to have a way that you can remove their lands before they're able to get to resolving a Wormcoil Engine. In the sideboard here, we've got lots of different options. I'm a huge fan right now of Destructive Revelry. It does 2 damage to the controller of an enchantment or artifact that you destroy. Abrupt Decay is a very solid choice. Molten Rain, because it does damage and it destroys non-basic lands, it's great for those matchups against Urzatron. Blood Moon is solid, although I'd add a basic swamp if you're going to do that. I like the things that actually destroy land and do damage as opposed to just immobilizing them for a little while. I would rather do damage. As I mentioned earlier, Sudden Shock is also amazing. A lot of people I know also swear by Rakdos Charm. If you're going to run into a lot of red decks, consider putting a Dragon's Claw in there because you'll win the mirror match, but I honestly think it's not worth really worrying about generally. Also, you can turn this into a really cool looking deck if you want. These are the cards you should definitely be looking for in order to pimp the deck out. Thanks, this has been Brian Rowe with a modern deck tech for Bob Bolt. I love this deck. If you have any ideas on how to make it better, please let me know.